March 21st, although this is March 12th, but anyway, we're here celebrating March 21st. It began, I think, the celebration of the International Day for Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in a room much like this. Government did not own the celebration of March 21. It came out of the community. And I know, because I was one of the first organizers of the International Day for Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We did it at Trinity United Church on Bloor Street, and it was in their, I guess their, whatever they call it, church part. Anyway, right, with pews, all that kind of stuff. And really, it came because of the activity of grassroots organizations from the Asian community, the South Asian community, the Latino community, the Aboriginal community, who saw the opportunity of, as Grace Edwards said to us, coming together horizontally to look at what was common in our lives in Canada, and that was the impact of racism. And to be able to articulate our concerns as various communities trying to push government to act on our behalf. Government got involved later on when the groundswell became so important that they couldn't ignore it anymore. And some folks like me weren't in community anymore, we were in government, so we were able to introduce those changes from the inside. Anyway, government has obviously declared it's no longer important. And here we are, because we know it's very important. So Grace Edwards has done a remarkable amount of work in the university over the past while talking about racism in post-secondary education. This is beyond primary and secondary school. And I can assure you he's not alone in those concerns. I'm editing a book that's coming out for the Center for Policy Alternatives in just about a month or so. And I've got 5 out of 20 authors who are writing about post-secondary institutions and the racism that is happening within them. And it's not just in Ontario, it's across the country. Anyway, I'm here tonight to talk about racial profiling. And as with many issues, I was talking to Dr. Rover earlier about how the media, sadly enough, pays attention to us when it's important to sell papers. So some of you will remember in 2002 when the Toronto Star came out with its series of articles called Singled Out. And it caused this great tumult at the time because City Hall was incredibly reactionary in terms of its leadership, both the mayor, Glassman, the chair of the Police Services Board, Norm Gardner, and the chief of police at the time, Julian Fantino. And they each said, this is just a load of, and you can put your expletive in, and that sort of suits the day. But the Toronto Star's motivation was not simply a social justice one. I want to point that out. It was one recognizing that in the United States, because of various actions coming out of community, backed by the American Civil Liberties Union, newspapers were selling papers quite dramatically because they were covering these cases. And the Toronto Star said, there's an angle on audience. Let's do out something. Thankfully it was done, and it raised the profile on the issue. But as you notice, for the next 2010? 8 years, the Toronto Star has been pretty quiet about racial profiling. Meanwhile, this is a daily phenomenon in our lives, and not just in our lives in terms of walking down the streets, but actually walking through airports, where we see it so much more graphically, and we'll see it a bit more graphically when they start bringing in those body scanners in the next little while. Now, why is this so? I put out a book a couple of years ago called Conflict, Crisis, and Accountability, based on some research I was doing that community asked me to do originally, and then I was able to take the work and turn it into a book. And one of the things that I recognize in doing the research is how often our lives are under scrutiny by law enforcement authorities. Now that's one thing that we all agree with. But what also I discovered was that this veil of racialization that is used is also an attack on democracy, period. And so we become the vehicles by which government is actually able to put into place undemocratic measures that basically look to control our society. The question is, how do they do it? They use fear. Fear of the other. Fear of these racialized hordes, who will overpopulate our society, who have crime on their minds, who are sexually licentious. You can go on and on and on with all the various ways that we are described. And so what they do, in essence, is say, well, we've got to stop this. But in doing it, and we're protecting you, you lose a little bit of your freedoms. And people don't seem to mind. It seems to be this refrain. What I want to try to do to kind of bring us to this point of where we are today is just go through some of the quotes I use in the book. And if you're interested in a copy of the book, I did bring some with me, so we can talk afterward. Always have to do that. Shameless self-promotion. So, W.E.B. Du Bois. We are all familiar with Du Bois. Those of us who are involved in the field of anti-racism can't help but be. Well over 100 years ago, he wrote, and I'm quoting here, "I am given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen." Now, when you look at Du Bois' work, the volumes upon volumes, it's hard to find such a quote. I found this quote in a book on philosophy and the whiteness in philosophy that came out in 2004. And the person who was editing the book, basically said, we're facing the same challenge now as Du Bois wrote about in the early 1900s. Not much has really changed over time. And when we look at the issue of policing and racism and racial profiling in particular, in other words, who are the police told, taught, and encouraged to apprehend or to monitor? In North America, particularly when it comes to certain bodies, and those bodies are black, when it comes to domestic issues, and becoming increasingly and importantly brown when it comes to international travel, right, has been around for some over 300 years. So, for example, in the 1600s in Virginia, which was then a colony, the authorities established that it was okay for any white person to stop any person of African descent at any time of the day, anywhere, whether the person of African descent was free or slave. That's 1600s. And when we go through the history, not just in the United States, but also here in Canada, let's be assured, we find those values are still very much the same. Right? So a while ago, Clayton Moisher, when he was writing his book on systemic racism in Ontario, looked at what was happening from 1900 up to 1965. And what he found is that the same patterns that we find when we begin looking at the Commission on Systemic Racism in the criminal justice system, the same thing that Toronto Star found, the same thing that I find in a lot of the literature I've gone through, is that there's this sort of pecking order in who gets stopped, who gets arrested, who gets allowed to go home on bail, who gets remanded, etc., etc. And the pecking order, no surprise, persons of African descent, Aboriginal people, Asians, right to the bottom. Even though the crimes may be similar, or crimes committed by whites may be worse. Yet they will be able to access bail, they will be able to argue the charges in court, likely hire lawyers because of the difference in economy and that kind of thing. If they are in prison, the time in prison will be less so than it will be for persons of color and Aboriginal people, and so on. And the sad part of this is that this is not an unknown phenomenon. When I did this work, my question was, wow, where are we going to find evidence in Canada to prove that racial profiling exists? No police force in Canada until Kingston, I guess in 2005 or 6, undertook a study. And now we find from the Toronto Star that the Toronto police have actually been asking their officers to identify the race of individuals that they are stopping, questioning, searching, arresting, etc. This was news to me that they were doing this. Isn't that interesting? And I'm not sure how many people here knew that the Toronto police were doing this until the Toronto Star came out with that story. Right? Anyway, the police force across Canada has been saying quite unanimously, there's no problem here, there's no evidence. And when pressed to gather evidence, they said, oh, we don't have to gather evidence, no problem, no one's complaining about it. Well, as a researcher, what you do in the area where you don't have evidence, you use this term called inference. In other words, can we look at other areas that have similar construction in terms of its laws, in terms of its socially constructed values and systems, etc., etc., to see if something's happening there, and can you then test that against 2 or 3 places. So what I did is I went to the United States. And not that the United States cities were very interested in actually gathering information around racial profiling. Most of it happened because they lost lawsuits in the courts and were ordered to gather evidence on racial profiling. Documents became available in what's called discoveries, when lawyers begin to exchange information, that showed memos from senior police officials saying, you will stop these people. More so than you'll stop them, because these people are suspect. And the people who were suspect in terms of the war on drugs, a Reagan-sponsored initiative in the 1980s, were people of African descent and Latinos.